Shelli, welcome back to another segment in our series.
Cool.
Yeah, it's good to have you. Yeah, this topic hit me as a little bit heavy, but I know it's a really important one. And I think that's contractor, subcontractor controls in your mind, what makes them win-win? So could you just touch on, why very specific, clear requirements are needed in this scenario?
So without a contract, it's kind of like the Wild West. At the end of the day, you're building a product, right? And your biggest fear is that third party that's going to end up suing the general. The general's going to bring the subcontractor in it. So now you've become a united front from the third party. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Yeah. So, and then between you, if you're in a fight and there's no insurance here and there's no insurance there, now you're fighting and this isn't being handled with the homeowner. So having everything, knowing each side knows what they're responsible for is by far the best, because you're going to have a clear path. The attorneys won't spend all their time fighting, and this thing's going to get handled instead of being drug out forever.
And in the name of definitions, does control or controls basically mean contract in this case? Okay.
Pretty much,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there's different layers. You have to get their safety plan and make sure their L&I's up and all that kind of thing from the general contractor standpoint. And the subcontractor should do their due diligence on a general too. They should make sure that general contractor is actually licensed and so forth too.
Yeah.
I mean, it does go both ways. They should be doing their checking reputation and all that kind of thing as well. So if you're working with a general that's got a ton of liens against him, you probably don't want to work for that general, right?
That's a good point.
There's it does go both ways. And as far as the contracts themselves, unfortunately, no one reads them. Drives me crazy. And the language that's in so many of them is old boilerplate language from the 80s. We used to buy insurance a la carte. So you used to be able to buy your action over and your contractual and your premises liability and everything individually. And then we went to a blanket policy that covers everything except for what's excluded.
Okay.
Much more effective because it fills the gaps in there, because there's gray areas when you do that, right? So the language that I see in most subcontractor agreements is still using the old language. Like there is no such thing as blanket contractual. That does not exist. I see it all the time. So how do you, when you have language in your contract that isn't even what we sell or use today, now you've left a bunch of time for the attorneys to argue about it. So you need to use current terminology, and that just drives me crazy. Anyway, so constantly that's what I see is old terminology. They don't understand it. So now you've got a contract that you don't understand either way. And then what happens often is the subcontractor doesn't send that contract to their agent, and they just say, send, so-and-so homes a certificate.
Yeah.
Nobody's reviewed the contract to know if they've met the terms of it at that point, right? And the only way you're going to find out how your policy performs or whether you've made a mistake is when the claim comes and now nobody has insurance, right? And now you're united front against that homeowner's not being met.
Yeah.
And then now you're suing each other because you haven't met your contract terms, and it doesn't become anything about the actual construction any longer. It's just about contract.
What will no written contract mean in the case of a claim?
Yeah, that's the Wild West.
Basically.
Yeah, then it just becomes all tort and, and where Washington is so consumer friendly that they're going to win and take you both to the cleaners.
Could you talk about the certificate of insurance and what the functions and limitations are of that type of document?
Oh, absolutely. This is where I live. So certificate of insurance is merely an evidence of insurance. It has no value in and of itself. Okay. On the very top of it, it's got a disclaimer. It says this is a matter of information only. It doesn't mean anything unless the policy's been endorsed and named as additional insured. So just by mere statements and checking boxes and everything, all that is meant to be is evidencing that policy's in existence.
Okay.
Which is why...
Hasn't lapsed, but we don't know anything about it.
Right. That doesn't even have cancellation provisions on it anymore. It used to be that there was a box that said, we have to give 30 days notice of cancellation to whoever the holder is or something. That's gone. And then it says if you're named as an additional insured, this certificate doesn't matter. And basically it says this doesn't confer any rights upon anybody, blah, 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 right? So it's telling you it's toilet paper. That's why it says, and everybody's always asking for those forms to be attached, the additional insured forms, because that's your ticket to the party, as I refer to it.
Okay. So what is needed to request a certificate of insurance?
Well, the contract will say we have to have proof of insurance naming you as a primary and non-contributory additional insured with these, a premises additional insured, premises and liability, the one side of coverage during construction.
Okay.
And then additional insured for completed operations after construction, and they are two separate forms, have to be attached, and it should outline the limits of insurance and things that are required, right? That's in the contract. Then the certificate should match. Problem is that most of the time those things are coming into the office and the subcontractor doesn't really know what they've got necessarily. They haven't, right? They might have signed a contract saying they're going to provide auto liability, excess liability, and pollution, and they only have a general liability policy.
Yeah.
They've called their agent and said, please send so-and-so home's certificate. They, on the other side, they don't have any idea, right? The girl that's collecting certificates is just going, oh yeah, I have a certificate, I can pay the guy.
Yeah, right?
Looks them up on L&I, which only says general liability. They look good on L&I, I can cut a check. Okay. Nobody knows that this isn't accurate or right until the claim happens.
That makes sense.
So it's super important internally. If the agent doesn't help, then they need a risk manager to come in and explain that process. Or hire. It's so much better to hire a third party to review those.
Okay.
If you do that, you get a credit on your insurance, usually more than what it costs you to do that.
That makes sense.
And you don't have to give that service a vacation or pay, right? You don't have to pay medical for it. Right. It's pretty cheap. And then you have that peace of mind that they're actually being monitored by a professional that knows what they're looking at.
Yeah. Maybe you could touch on how dates and or timing could potentially impact coverage versus no coverage.
Oh, and this is a big one right now, especially in the hard market. What oftentimes happens is that they don't get the certificate of insurance, and that all the contracts say you must have your certificate of insurance prior to the work starting.
They missed that deadline date.
Yes. Okay. And the policies all have rules in them. So on the general contractor level, says you must obtain these things from your subcontractors, and they all say prior to the work, it has to have these things. It spells out the rules because they're getting a pricing consideration because they've agreed to do this to help protect the insurance carrier. Remember, it's a contract. You're going to pay this. I agree to do that. So this is the agreement that they've made. And if they don't do it, there's a penalty. Oftentimes it's no coverage, or it means now the general contractor's policy might become excess over the subs. Okay. So now you may have created yourself $1 million deductible, because it's not going to pay till what the sub's insurance, full limits paid out, and even in the absence of it, what it should have, right? Or it creates maybe a large, now it's $100,000 deductible instead of $5,000, or, there's all kinds of penalties, and that is different. And the sub's not usually privy to that, but then that generates what's put into the subcontractor agreement is the rules. So that's why they change sometimes year to year if they change carriers or something. Yeah. And then that subcontractor's insurance should match that, and they should know what they're doing. So the best way to prevent any problems is to always send the contract to the agent and say, review my insurance section and let me know where I might be deficient.
Yeah.
Now you've put an E&O claim against your agent if they missed anything. Now you have a backstop to that.
E&O, errors and omissions.
Yes.
Okay.
So example I did in another segment was where the agent issued a certificate saying that it was a 14-unit townhome project, right on the certificate when they use additional insured, and then the forms list said they had a townhome exclusion. Well, now that subcontractor and that general contractor are now united front against that agent, because that's the only place for recovery.
Yeah.
So if you put it on the agent to qualify and make sure you have everything, you've added that. So that is a protection, but you should give them any examples. For me, I make my builder an example. Here's what your certificate should look like. So if you get one from a subcontractor, and everybody fills them out a little bit differently, but you should be able to go limits, down the thing and compare, right? So if there's a whole section missing, there's a problem. If the whole auto liability section's blank and your contract requires auto, gotta send it back. I need auto, or stopgap, or whichever coverage is missing.
Great lead in. The last question I had to wrap up this segment was, why is auto liability required in these situations?
Right. That goes back to they don't get there on Metro, and you as the general contractor are liable for anything that happens on the job site. And as the subcontractor, you've agreed to indemnify that general contractor for anything that you've created on that job site as an accident or injury or anything from your employees who are driving on and off, or lower tier subcontractors that you've hired. So now you're responsible for all their autos. So now if you don't have any owned autos, you have to buy what's called non-owned auto liability, which covers you for auto liability for vehicles that you do not own.
Yeah.
Right? Or if you have owned autos, any agent would put non-owned auto on there. They'd be crazy not to.
Okay. So say I'm a small siding sub, for sake of conversation. I'm working for a big national builder and we're in this situation. Do they have people on staff that'll sort of help walk me through that and point out the areas where I'm deficient and I can't work for them? Is that kind of pretty cut and dried, or would they just sort of sign me up and, hey,
No, they're
Jim's
gonna,
hanging out there a million miles and we're just going to let it go?
No, those big, large nationals, they know how important this is, and you do not get on their job site without.
So they would help,
Oh yeah.
in a way, help protect.
Most of
their
them
subs.
use third-party consultants to monitor them, unless they have our own. Some of them have just full-time in-house people that do it for them, that are licensed agents and know what or hire a in-house risk manager that does that for them. And you don't get on the site unless you're good. And they have ironclad contracts that, in some cases, actually contradict the law. In Washington, as the general contractor, there's an indemnification law specific to just construction that's separate from the overall indemnification law. And a lot of attorneys I've found don't even know it exists, but it basically says that you, as the general contractor, cannot transfer your sole obligation, your sole strict liability, like, say, ownership of the land. Right? You own that land. Somebody trips and falls. Granny comes along at night and trips and falls on your land. That's not related to the construction. And it's your liability because you own the land. Right? So that is a sole liability. Right? So you can't transfer that down to your sub. And they will literally say, it literally calls out the law in some of these national builders and say, irregardless of that law, you're responsible for anything that happens on that job site, day or night, whether we're there or not. Anything. And they buy less insurance because they know they've pushed it down and they've made it ironclad and they've checked the insurance.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, you've done a great job of raising my knowledge level. And I'm sure our audience as well.
Terrified, right?
Slightly.
It's all about the contracts. At the end of the day, you can build something perfectly.
It's true.
But if your contracts are bad, you're in trouble.
Got a problem. Again, thank you.
You bet.